In recent months, with events at Scientific American involving freelancers, bloggers, and the blog editor, Borizakovich, who is no longer there, we're going to look at all of those issues, but we want to do a couple of things here. We wanted to think of this still as a conversation that we wanted to have in person, which is why we came up with the idea in the first place. We want to thank the National Association of Science Writers for being open-minded to this conversation in the spring and for allowing us to open it up into a larger conversation within the last few weeks. And we want it to be a conversation that allows us to move forward. We encourage any and all of you, and we hope you will, to come up and share ideas and experiences and suggestions that are going to move this issue forward. We're going to hope to do this on the panel. We have a phenomenally great panel here today. I'm very lucky to be moderating this, and they're all in the program, but just to recapitulate, we have Emily Willingham from XX Science, Florence Williams, who's the author of the best-selling book Breasts, Kathleen Raven, who is a well-known and acclaimed freelancer and blogger, Christy Ashwindan, another well-known and acclaimed freelancer and a well-known writer, everything for Runner's World, right, Christy, among many other publications, and Maren McKenna, who is a co-blogger with me at Wired and the author of Superbug, which a couple years ago, I think, won the NASW Book Award. So it's an honor to be here with all of them. What I want to do first is start with what I think of as a sort of background on the issue, which involves data. And so I have a PowerPoint here. It was put together by a former graduate student of mine, Kate Pringaman, who is now a natural resources reporter in Washington State, which I think lays the groundwork for some of the issues we want to talk about. Kate wrote this slide, and she is the smiling person right there in the black turtleneck. And it makes a point that I think we all should recognize, that when we start looking at who's going into science writing at an entry level, they are frequently women. And this is equally true when you look outside the University of Wisconsin, where I teach. But when you move into the professional world, you start seeing this, 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 this. There's an asterisk on Open Lab, which is an anthology of bloggers created by Bora. Open for further discussion. NASW, I'm happy to tell you, actually looks pretty good in this landscape. But let's look a little bit farther. Again, an asterisk on the Scientific American blogs for reasons I don't think I have to repeat. National Geographic, Wired, Discover. Magazine contributors, we just picked 3 publications as a representative example. Editors. No one is going to pretend that this is just an issue for science writers alone. So when we have the conversation, we think, if we can't change the whole world, maybe it's time to at least start talking about changing our part of it. because changing our part of the world is part of changing the whole world. And with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to each make a brief statement that addresses this point in general or from personal experience. I'm going to start with Emily Willingham, and we'll move down to Maren at the end. Emily?
Is this on? Can you hear me? It's on. Cody's? Hi, everybody. So when Deb first invited me to join this panel, that was, several months ago, and I thought I was joining it so that I could talk about this little enterprise I helped to found called XX Science. And we founded this website so that we could bring science that was of interest to women readers, and we wanted to do it most often by way of women science writers. We also spend a lot of time on the site talking about women scientists as well. As it turned out, recent events have kind of tabled that intended focus that I had coming in, although I'm going to come back around to it at the end of what I have to say here. And instead, I ended up focusing my mind on a word that we hear a lot, and that word is privilege. And the word privilege means private laws. And I know that for a lot of people, you hear this word so much that it has almost lost meaning for some people, not for all of us. But the fact is that in the two issues that we're talking about here today, this word actually has two very important meanings. The issues that we're discussing here, let's just say it, are sexual harassment and sexual equality. When it comes to sexual harassment, the definition of privilege that matters is the one that says that each of us has a right to our own private selves, to our own private way of conducting ourselves without infringement, and that we have a right not to be harassed. The second meaning of privilege is related to the concept of social privilege, and that relates to the equality issue. Social privilege is that ease of living and success that we have because, for whatever reason, and we all have some form of this privilege, we are members of a group that enjoys some benefits of some feature we have that we did not ourselves create. And that feature can be something like ethnicity or sex or gender. And I think it's important for those of us who have whatever privilege we do have to be mindful that with that comes a responsibility to be aware and mindful about not excluding those who do not share that privilege, but whose work warrants recognition. And that takes me back to XX Science. We developed that site initially. This started like a couple of years ago because we noticed, I'm sure some of you have noticed, that the magazines that are classically oriented, the publications classically oriented to women, don't tend to have science departments. And we feel, the editors of XX Science, and I'm one of them, we feel that it's important to include women in all facets of the science conversation, and that includes as readers and as writers and as scientists. And so, in closing, I'd just like to say that I strongly recommend the XX Science tactic of mindful inclusion if we're going to be addressing these issues of the privilege that every single one of us brings to this table.
Hi, I think I got asked to be on this panel because I wrote a book called Breasts, which is about as XX as you can get, although I will say that men do have breasts, and they do get breast cancer. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about my experience in writing for sort of men's magazines and writing for women's magazines. When I started out, I really assiduously avoided writing for women's magazines and writing about women's topics. I sort of aspired to, the mainstream publications, which were largely sort of big boy publications like the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine. At one point, I was writing a lot for Outside, and Outside actually started a magazine called Women Outside for a while. I don't know if you remember that, but it was a sort of short-lived, colossal failure. And it was, it was kind of an admission of failure at the outset because they, kind of acknowledged, okay, you're right, we actually don't write anything about women in Outside, and we don't have a lot of women writers in Outside. So we're going to sort of ghettoize this whole project and have a magazine just for women, but we're going to underfund it, and we're going to understaff it. And by the way, Florence, would you like to write for it? And I said, no way. You know, it just instantly became clear to me that if I did that, I would be, you know, sort of shooting myself in the foot. And it also, you know, just sort of made me mad that women just weren't being included, you know, in sort of the big boy magazine. I felt at the time that, and I still feel this way, that, you know, as we all know, separate is not equal. And it seemed important to sort of make a stand and sort of stay, you know, with the mainstream magazine, which is what I did. And by the way, I'm not sure that the women's magazines are sort of doing women a lot of favors. I did do some work for women's magazines, and at one point I was told that I couldn't write about a woman, couldn't profile a woman unless she was beautiful, which really shocked me at the time. I think that's just the way it still works at women's magazines. At Outside, I am now one of 2 women contributing editors out of 21. So it feels like sort of a lonely place. So it's sort of funny that I ended up coming to a place where I wrote a book called Breasts. And for me, writing the book actually was a feminist project, because I felt like it was important to sort of reclaim breasts from their place of hypersexualized objectification. You know, sort of write about, you know, the evolutionary miracles that they are. So it was a feminist project, but I was also very aware that it had this kind of anti-feminist subtext, which was potentially putting me in a place of being labeled a woman who writes about women's issues, which is sort of, can be, you know, a kiss of death. And interestingly, I will just point out that men who write about men's issues do not have this problem. When men write about men's issues, it is not considered men's issues. It's just considered, you know, Lance Armstrong can write about recovering from testicular cancer, and it's not considered, you know, a male audience book. So, you know, I think there are some pitfalls still, and lots of things to talk about in terms of, you know, how we find an audience, how we assert our space in a more sort of degendered journalistic world. So, look forward to conversation.
Excuse me. I'm Kathleen Raven, and I came in here directly from another session. I had a scientific paper I wanted to share with you. I'll summarize it here and not eat into my 3 minutes. But we all deal with harassment, and even guppies, even guppies deal with harassment. And that was the paper I wanted to read part of the abstract from. Stories, actionable items, and moving forward. That's what I'll cover. My story will only make one statement on it, and that is that to the former blogs editor of Scientific American, Boris Zivkovich, I gave repeated warnings. And so I did all that I could, I thought, to stop the harassment. So one of the things that I'm very excited about is that the Twitter community was actually mostly positive when this topic broke out. And so I'm hoping that we keep some of that positive energy in the room here. Some male colleagues and female asked me, so what are you doing to prevent this going forward? Well, I think we have to all be very deliberate in our actions. I do have a hearing loss, and it does require me to stare actually very intensely into the face of the female or male that I happen to be looking at, and I read lips. And so understandably, this can sometimes be misconstrued as that I'm very interested in the person, when really I'm just trying to hear you. And so I actually plan to make that clear when talking with my male colleagues. I had just recently found someone at Harvard who kind of took me under his wing and was helping to talk about agricultural issues. And so I emailed my mentor there at Harvard after all this happened, and I said, look, I'm going to lay out a few things for you. I enjoyed our in-person conversation the other day. He happened to be in Atlanta for a conference. I enjoyed our in-person conversation. I wanted to let you know that I enjoy competitions of wit in conversation because I just think that's conversationalism. Whoa, wit in conversation is a skill and something I admire. And I said, if that can be construed as flirting to you, I will refrain from it. And I told him I am only interested in talking about this topic with him. He replied back in a very gracious email and said, I respect you for letting me know where you are up front, and I am also only interested in being your mentor. And the book is closed. And it was so refreshing and so empowering. And I also felt a little silly having to say that, but I think that that is where we may have to go next to address rampant sexual harassment that I have dealt with throughout my entire career. The looking forward part, there is a code of conduct in Macmillan Company. However, it does not state explicitly sexual harassment. It talks about harassment. And I want the language of policies that all of us work with, freelancers and in companies. I want the language to be explicit, and I want the chain of command to be very clear of how to go forward and express your grievances without fear of losing a job.
So I wasn't involved in this sexual harassment scandal, I guess we can call it. But one thing that really occurred to me when it broke was I was really struck by how many men were just sort of like amazed that this could happen and could happen in our community, whereas most of the women I knew were like, same shit, different day. But then I was thinking, and I, like I said, I had nothing to do with that one, and I didn't know the people involved, so I'm not commenting on that. But I was just reminded of this experience I had. I went to Vietnam a few years ago. I was there. I was traveling with a videographer, a man, and about halfway through the trip, he made this comment to me about these women that were grabbing him and trying to pull him into these, you know, massage parlors or whatever. And I was like, oh my God, really? You know, and then I realized, oh, right, like I know that sex tourism is a thing in this place that we were at. And when he told me, it sort of made sense. And it was happening right there, but it was just happening when I was looking away. And once he said it, then all of a sudden I could see it everywhere. But until then, I mean, I was really, it just felt like a very apt analogy, and it kind of gave me a little bit more understanding of why, you know, there were those reactions. And so anyway, I sort of felt like at first when we were talking about this panel, like enough with the stories, we've heard enough. But then I thought, but hey, maybe some of these men need to know what it's like. So I just want to tell a few just sort of random but probably representative things that you know, I've had happen to me. And I think for me, the double X question, I think that was the title of the panel, is really not so much about harassment, although that's obviously still an issue and it's an important one that we should deal with, but it's this feeling of marginalization. It's this feeling that no matter what I do, I'm always, every time, having to fight to be judged on my work and to be seen. It's this feeling of invisibility. So these are just a few examples. This first one happened to me last week. I was on the phone with a source, and about halfway through the interview, he said, wow, I didn't think you were going to ask such tough questions. And I was like, okay. And he said, you know, I thought you were a high school student. How did he think that I was a high school student? Well, he'd gone to my website, which lists all my credentials right there, but he hadn't gotten that far because he'd seen my photo and decided that I was a high school student. Anyone who's paying attention, like, I know he wasn't trying to flatter me. You know, he had just dismissed me. I was, whatever, he was not paying, no one who was paying attention would mistake that photo on my website for an 18-year-old. And then as we were parting, he said, your husband should let you out of the house. I don't even know, like, where do I begin with that? You know, I wish that it had stopped there, but it didn't. About a week later, he sent me a really creepy essay that he'd written and referred to me in a very uncomfortable way. I found out that he had also submitted it to a magazine where a friend of mine worked. That really didn't feel very good. And, you know, I just want to point out, I didn't feel at all physically threatened by this guy. It wasn't, you know, he wasn't going to do anything to me. The thing that I felt was dismissed. Like, my ideas didn't matter. I thought that we'd been having this conversation as sort of like intellectual, I don't want to say equals. I mean, this guy was older than me and more accomplished, whatever. But, you know, I thought that I mattered, but you know, my ideas didn't matter. And I felt kind of stalked. I was at another conference, and I had a beer with a really nice editor. It was all on the up and up. He was a great guy. I mean, I really do think he was a good guy. I'd been writing pretty regularly for his magazine, and these were almost all stories that they were coming to me with. And I told him, I said, you know, I'd really like to get on your masthead. Like, what's my next move? What do I need to do? He just kind of shook his head. Not going to happen. Yeah, the message that I heard is, you will never belong here. Visiting this same magazine in their fancy offices, I was meeting with my editor that I worked with most regularly, and she was praising my work, and she said, hey, you know, I'm looking for some more writers. Do you have anyone to recommend? And so the first name out of my mouth was a woman, and she kind of took me aside and told me under her breath that she had to really be careful about assigning too many stories to women. You know, she was actually the only woman I saw in the office. She was young and she was beautiful. She was also extremely talented. She was good. She deserved her job. But, you know, good luck convincing anyone of that. When you're the only woman in an office and you're hot, she's going to have a hard time. She's no longer there. She was already planning her escape route. But, you know, it's really, you know, a lot of people will say, oh, she's using it. You know what? She's getting as hurt by it as she's benefiting. There was this feature story package that I pitched to a magazine that I write for all the time. My editor loved the idea. It's great. We want to do it. Waiting. You know, when are you going to send the contract? Oh, yeah, it's happening. It's happening. A year passed, literally. There was this thing and that thing. All of a sudden, one of their male contributors pitched a story on this topic, and so they assigned it. They gave the narrative portion to him, and they gave the service to me. The guy took all the credit. This particular magazine hasn't published a single narrative feature by a woman since I started keeping track. There's a small cadre of men who write the sexy features, and the women contributors get assigned all the how-to stories. A couple years ago, a magazine came to me with an assignment. They wanted me to write about this medical test that everyone needed. Except when I looked into it, it turned out that no one needed this test. And so it was all hype, and I proposed writing that. They wouldn't listen. I pulled out. I lost a mortgage-sized paycheck. About 3 months later, I opened the magazine at the grocery store and saw this very story with the angle I proposed, written by one of their male contributors. Another time, I completed a short assignment for a men's magazine. And the editor called me up to tell me that the magazine's publisher really liked the story. And they wanted to make it a section feature, so I was stoked, like more money, you know, more words, except that I wasn't going to get more money because the publisher wanted the story written by a New York Times reporter who just published a story on the topic. Hey, wait, I write for the New York Times. Didn't matter. They killed my story, and of course I was left having to insist that they pay me the full fee, which they did. Anyway, speaking of pay, I personally know of 2 publications. These are good publications that we all would like to write for or have written for, that systematically pay women staffers less than men, or pay women staffers less than men. Yeah, this needs to stop. I don't want special treatment. I don't want quotas. I just want a chance. I want to be judged and rewarded based on my work. That's all.
So I'm really struck by how full this room is. And I'm really grateful to all of you for coming, especially since you could have been doing the tour of the Bat House instead. So whether you're here out of support or out of skepticism or because you thought we were going to rehash what the board this morning called the recent events, I'm still grateful to all of you for being in the room, so thank you for joining the conversation. That said, I have to confess that I originally joined the idea for this panel with Deb in the spring, sort of out of exasperation about a particular thing that had happened to me. But as I've been thinking about it, the issue more over the ensuing 6 months, and especially the recent events of the past month, I think now I have to confess that I am speaking from a position of discouragement. The experiences that Kathleen and Chris described are very similar to ones I had earlier in my career. And I thought as I got more experienced that things would change, that power dynamics and sexual dynamics would be less of an issue, and that I would be judged at least partially on my expertise. I'm now a freelancer, but I spent many years in newspapers, and for all of those years, there probably was not a week that went by when I did not sit in a meeting and hear a woman advance an idea and not get a reaction. I already can see so many heads nodding in the audience, and hear a man voice essentially the same idea within 5 minutes and be acknowledged for it. If you have not worked in newspapers, you may have been in meetings like this in magazines or certainly in academic departments. And even as a freelancer, though I now essentially work for myself or for a variety of contracted people, I continue to feel that I live in a world that is in some fundamental way unbalanced as to gender. I was one of the launch bloggers of the Wired Science Network, which has now been going for 3 years, and I love Wired and I am profoundly loyal to them, but the reality is that for most of 2 of the 3 years that it's existed, I was the only woman blogger in that network. There are now, fortunately, 3 others, Deb and also Mary Bates and also Gwen Pearson. So things are getting better, but it was a very unsettling position to be in. In fact, I think I inadvertently inspired a hashtag at the time. So I think of this construction, this situation to myself as sort of the invisible woman, and I'm really glad that Christy raised the issue of invisibility and marginalization. Because as I am now in a more experienced position, I'm working really hard here not to use the word old, so work with me, okay? I continue to see this kind of imbalance in mastheads, in tables of contents. Wired, I'm sorry to say, is often used as an example of that. And, you know, as someone who's invested several decades at this point in a particular specialty, to the point where at Wired they call me Scary Disease Girl, when I look around at this imbalance, I see stories, and sometimes staff positions, but more often it's individual stories, that for which women with particular known expertises clearly should have been tapped, and yet somehow were not visible to the editors doing the commissioning. I'll give you just one example, and it's in a way it's unfair to call out a single magazine because I'm sure they have their reasons, but this happened just in the past 24 hours, so it's my most current example, which is that yesterday, as I was traveling, I was reading a piece in the online science magazine Nautilus by my friend Brandon Keim, who's a fantastic science writer. Brandon is male, in case you can't tell from that name. And he was talking about in his story about the problems of global supply chains and how hard it was to define them. And in the midst of his story was a link that was clearly a story about, it was within a sentence about containerized shipping and what role that plays in global supply chains. And it said, see the story, the box that changed the world. And I instantly thought, oh, how fantastic. They must have commissioned a story from Rose George, who just in the past 2 months published a massive and fantastic book, 90% of Everything, How Containerized Shipping, I can't recite the full subtitle, but it's How Containerized Shipping Brings the World to Your Door. And so I clicked through to it, and it wasn't by Rose. It was by a male writer whom I've never heard of. I'm sure he's a particularly fantastic writer, but I haven't asked Rose about the situation, and I haven't asked Nautilus, and as I said, I'm sure they have their reasons. But each individual magazine has their reasons of particular relationships, particular contributing editor contacts, particular people whom they have worked with before. All together, they make up a pattern in which consistently women are just not showing up. And after seeing this in my own career and in the career of many of my colleagues for decades, I feel we have come to a point where it's really necessary that this change. So thank you.
This is an all-woman panel, as you may have noticed. I wanted to give us a chance to tell our stories. I am glad, and make our points. I'm glad to see that there are so many men in the room, and we really hope to hear from you in the conversation. But there was a particular reason why this panel was structured the way it was. The last thing I want to say is we do want this to be a conversation that makes a difference. We came up with a kind of informal, basic manifesto of things that we think are important in the way we would like to see the world change. Equal pay for equal work, more gender equality in head bylines and mastheads, equal recognition of award-worthy work. As you probably saw, there is a definite imbalance in the way awards tend to be meted out. A recognized code of conduct that includes freelancers. We've had many conversations, especially in the last few weeks, over the ways that freelancers are particularly vulnerable because they're not part of the inside institution and not represented by the institution in the same way. A safe and clear process for reporting sexual harassment. And encouragement to talk frankly and directly about these issues so that they are not just recent events, but they are issues of concern to all of us. And with that, we'd like to open the conversation to everyone in the room. Please feel free to share a story or an idea. We hope to actually turn this into something useful or to ask a question of anyone here at the panel. The floor is yours. I think there are mics. Are there mics?
There's a mic over there.
Right.
There's a mic over here. We do want to let you know that this session is being recorded. The camera is pointed at us. If there's any reason why you don't want, we probably can't exclude your voice, but if there's any reason why you don't want your identity to be part of the permanent record, please just don't use your name when you speak into the mic. I think that will help.
But we really want to hear from you, so I'm glad to see you. Beryl?
Ladies first, thank you. I didn't intend to speak at this, but I had a reaction listening that was very surprising to me, and I don't want it taken the wrong way, but I believe, probably one of the oldest people in this room, and listening to you takes me back more than 40 years, okay? Now, I have to tell you that things are vastly, inconceivably better for women. You don't believe it, but I'm here to tell you that it is inconceivably better for women than it used to be, okay? I didn't learn to type because I knew when I got out of college with Phi Beta Kappa and a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship that if I knew how to type, that's what I would be doing. And the reason that there used to be many women in offices, and they were all typing or filing, okay, talking about the big box. I worked as a file clerk for Sealand Service in Port Elizabeth, New Jersey, which was the first place that containerized shipping existed in the world. In those days, that's what women did, okay? Except for the ones who didn't learn to type so that they wouldn't get those jobs. But the fact that it's incomparably better than it used to be doesn't mean that it's good enough. And in a very peculiar way, this is going to sound awful and you're all going to hate me for it, I was sort of glad to hear what you were saying, because now I can think, I've been so envious for many years thinking, oh, if only I were 10 years younger, I missed the generation. I'm of the wrong generation. If I were 10 or 15 years younger, I'd have been in the generation that went to Princeton, that got hired by the New York Times, that all that stuff. When they went looking for women, I'd have been there, but I wasn't. So what I was thinking was, wow, so if they're doing this, then maybe the fact that I haven't been as successful as I had hoped as a young woman wasn't that I am actually incompetent and not good enough, because this crap is still going on. It was incomparably worse, but it's still bad. And so I have to tell you that what you have to do is just persevere. I won't be here to see the success, because it's going to take forever. But you have to just persevere. Men are getting better. They actually...
I'd just like to say something here, and that is, first of all, thank you, all the men. I'm just really delighted to see so many men here.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing is that I think that this is really sort of a systematic problem. It's not. I feel like there are a lot of really great men. I mean, David Corcoran right here, Adam Rogers is probably somewhere here. There are a lot of really great editor men, and I feel like you're really our allies here. Yes. You know, I mean, this is something, you know, I think making men aware, just putting this issue on their radar in the same way that, you know, when I'm with this videographer, I mean, this is a different situation, but it's just like all of a sudden recognizing that, oh, wait, this happens, and like I should just be aware of it. And sort of when you see it, maybe you say something. You know, when this creep said this creepy thing to me, there were two men that witnessed it. They could have said, hey, knock it off.
Well, that's a
but
perfect...
they didn't.
This is the point that I think about that. 40 years ago, half the people in this room would have been smoking. And this is true, and nobody would have said or thought anything about it.
Thank you so much, Beryl.
And so that's what has to change. The culture has to change.
Yes.
And the men, it'll change when everyone changes,
And
not only the men.
And this conversation is part of affecting that change. Thank you. You made an absolutely fantastic point. Mike?
Thanks, Deb. I'm Mike Lemonick, and thank you for holding this panel, first of all. I really, you're doing an enormous service for all of us. Thanks to Christy for recognizing something, a point that I was going to make, but you made it, that lack of awareness doesn't necessarily, it can reflect just a lack of awareness. And if you're not actually doing, if you're not harassing people, and it's done one-on-one, you're surprised. Well, how can
and most of you are, I mean, most of you aren't harassing us, so thank you for that.
But you know, it's embarrassing to have this reaction. This can't be happening at this level, and I realized, well, it can be, and I wouldn't necessarily be aware of it, but I really appreciate you are all raising, and Beryl raising the consciousness of people who are not directly involved in this situation. Because if men are not aware that this goes on to the extent that it does, we can't be a part of the solution. So this is really helpful. And when Kathleen described the conversation she had with her mentor, you know, it's sort of horrifying that you should have to do that, but it's good that you do that, you know, because again, if consciousness is not raised among men, we're going to be unconscious. And so, thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Over here. And I'm just going to go back and forth. If I don't know your name, which I wish I knew everyone, just go ahead and identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Casey Deemer. I'm a master's student at the University of Southern California. Oh, sorry. Should I repeat? Are we good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Casey Deemer, University of Southern California, master's student. My question and the issue that I wanted to raise is, I completed my undergraduate degree, and a majority of the journalism majors were women. And I'm now pursuing my master's degree, and a majority of the people in the journalism programs are women. And I look around this room, obviously, we're talking about women's issues, but at the conference as a whole, there are much more women represented than I'm sure there were even 10, 15 years ago. So as more women are entering the journalism field, and we are becoming, if not an equal, but possibly a majority, perhaps not in the mastheads just yet, how can we kind of come together, because not everyone is perhaps in the science writing community, but in all writing communities, women are showing up more and more often in journalism. How do we come together to talk about these issues? Because there are much more of us and we can make our voices much louder.
And we do want to make our voices louder. Anyone?
A female editor took me aside one time and said, act more like a man, as advice to get ahead. I didn't think that was good advice, because I think the advice we should be giving to fellow women is to act like ourselves and to support each other. And if all men and women in this room keep an eye out and help each other in situations, then that's how it moves forward. You have to be so diligent. And I think we have to somehow try to step away from gender. In an interview in 2006, Morgan Freeman told Mike Wallace, "You stop calling me a black man and I'll stop calling you a white man." There are so many parallels between racism and sexism, and I think that we have to keep each other's back.
And I think it's okay for us to say we need to keep having these conversations openly as women. And we need to, as I think NASW has actually a committee to start looking at some of these issues, work within our own communities to build guidelines, to make suggestions, to have stronger codes, and to change the conversation in a way that I hope we change what I think of as accepted behavior. There's too much acceptance. Boys will be boys, or girls will be girls, if you will, of these behaviors, and I think we need to start saying we've had enough of accepted behaviors. We want to change that discussion and that framework. And I think we have to keep having these conversations.
I want to respond to your question, not your question, but your observation about the changing demographics, which was also in one of the slides that Deb showed. So it's possible, it may in fact be true, that the demographics of journalism are changing in such a way that it may at some point be a female majority profession. I'm an officer of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and I know that within our membership, and certainly at our conference, we see more women than men. But, and so perhaps we can assume that at a certain point, it will be inevitable for mastheads to be more populated by women, because the rising tide of women will force out the aging men. Even if that is true, that's still a generation of professional possibility lost until we get to that point. And we cannot guarantee, unless we actually see that the chains of mentorship and succession are being reoriented toward women, that women in that rising generation would in fact succeed to those posts. There's always the possibility that if you have a magazine class of junior editors of 20 women and 1 man, that it would be the man that would still be picked for mentorship. So while I just want to say that I acknowledge your point about the demographics, but I don't think we can allow the demographics by themselves to take care of the problem.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maren.
Hi. Yeah. I'm Nala Rogers. I'm a new science writer. This is my first time at one of these conferences. First of all, I want to offer my sincere thanks to all of you for putting this together, and to the women who came forward, first of all, to share their experiences and started the ball rolling here. I am absolutely one of the people who's benefiting most from this. There's every chance in the world I would have sat down with Bora at this meeting if this all hadn't come to light. And I resonated with what one of you said, that the men are shocked to hear that this could possibly happen, but women are just like, well, yeah, of course, you know, what happened yesterday, it'll happen tomorrow. I've had plenty of experiences that are in the same range. Also, thank you for explaining your decision to only have women on the panel. I was wondering about that. I feel it's important to include men in the solution as well. And I want to raise one other concern I have. I've gotten the feeling while I've been here that because of this blow up, men over the age of 40 are afraid of me. Like, they have the feeling that I could destroy their careers with a word because of one misinterpreted, simple gesture that was not meant in any kind of a harmful way. And I don't know what the solution there is, but I don't want people to be afraid of me. I want people to know that I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and I want to hopefully start a conversation, listen to men's and women's inputs here to find out how we can make a place that is safe for both men and for women.
Thank you. And I think we've talked about a safe environment where everyone feels comfortable. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think we're working in that direction, I hope. Does anyone else want to address that?
I want to say something. I mean, I think it's actually pretty easy not to be creepy. Like, I think a friend of mine who I won't call out, you know who you are. I'm not going to say his name. Anyway, was like really, we were kind of a group of us conversing about before the meeting about this. And like, oh my God, is no one going to hug anyone? And I'm like, this is crazy. Like, this is not about not being able, like, I've hugged a lot of people, a lot of men even, and that's fine. It's not about, I mean, the difference is like, okay, you're allowed to hug me in a friendly way if we're friends. You're not allowed to make comments on my appearance, you know, that have to do with, I think probably the easiest default, like, imagine that I'm your daughter and that you're some other guy, and treat me like you would want someone treating your daughter. I mean, this is just really, it's basic respect stuff. This isn't about not being able to be friendly. It's not about not being able to make jokes and things among friends when you're comfortable with that. This is really about, you know, treating people as human beings and not as only their gender or only, you know, their bodies or what they look like. So it's really like, let's not make this into something that it's not, which it's not about not being able to be friendly. It's about, you know, being appropriate and not appropriate. And honestly, I think that most men that are creepy, that do creepy stuff, know when they're being creepy. Like, I don't think they don't know. But the other thing is too, like, if a woman's being nice to you, like, I hope that everyone here has read Laura Helmuth's piece in Slate about this. It offers some really great advice for people who are mentoring. But just because a woman, especially a younger woman, maybe an up-and-coming science writer, and you're an older, more experienced one, if she's being nice to you, she's not flirting. Like, do not equate, like, woman being nice with flirting. Imagine that that person was of your same gender, if, you know, whatever. Like, I don't want to keep going on.
No, that was a really good point, Christy. Thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to that? And
I just had a comment, and that is, if you wouldn't say it to a man and you're straight, don't say it to us. It's really not that complicated.
Thank you. Over here.
I'm Ginger Campbell from the Brain Science Podcast, and I'm coming to science communication directly from medicine. I'm still a practicing physician, so I'd like to make some comments about how this problem exists within medicine. I have, which is now almost 50% women, so let me say, numbers aren't going to help. First, there's the invisibility issue seems to exist for all of us. And what I particularly have observed as I'm getting older is it's getting worse. My own Bora experience was having a conversation with him where I could tell that he wasn't listening to me because he was looking around at the young girls. So that's an issue that I don't know what the solution is, that they because as the men admit themselves, they're unconscious of the fact that they're not seeing us or hearing us. I have created a podcast that I think is probably the best science podcast out there, and I've been doing it almost 7 years, and no opportunities have come to me, even though I'm a physician doing a great podcast, interviewing scientists from all over the world. I've not gotten a single offer to do an article for any of these websites or anything. I can't help but think that it might not be a factor. So, I might be wrong, but
no, I think you're making, and I used to think to myself that the biggest problem for women was the enlightened man, because he was so positive that everything was okay, that all the issues, that we were all equal now, that we'd overcome all those obstacles, and so he just didn't see it like any of this. We saw. And one of the things that I think is important in this room is that we've had so many conversations between ourselves as women without having these conversations in the open. And that it's time that we really start having these conversations out in the open. That it matters. Thank you, Ginger. Over here.
Hello, my name is Chelsea Coombs, and I am a senior undergraduate student at the University of Illinois. I work for the school that I do that I'm majoring in, and I had to interview a department head / a PI, and he wasn't like inappropriate, but he was really rude to me, and I feel like I don't know if it was because he's just a rude person, but I kind of got the idea that he was very rude to me because of my gender, and he was talking down to me because, you know, he even brought in like a postdoc to tell me that I was wrong. So, you know, what would you do in that situation? Like, here I am, kind of like the lowly peon trying to do her job. And what would you do in that situation? Like, as a feminist, I feel like offended by myself that I didn't say, hey, like, stop being rude to me. But like, what do you do when you're in that situation? Like, that's just what I would like to have some advice on.
Panelists, have you been in that situation?
I've been in that situation a lot because I spend a lot of time in academia, and I don't know how many people can pull this off, but I look at them. And I'm not quite sure what else you say, except that, you know, so I've had a provost in a job interview in academic, and I've repeated this story many times. An academic job interview, I have a PhD in biology, it's an academic job interview for a biology job, appointment, tenure track, and he actually greeted me by saying, so Miss Emily Jane, that's how we began that conversation, and I said, Dr. Willingham. And I looked at him, but I don't know how many, you know, where you find the guns for that. And I've heard studies that say that women tend to have, there are two kinds of responses you can have to a situation that freaks you out. You can have the deer in the headlight response, right? And then later on the stairs, you have the stare response where you're like, shit, why didn't I say the thing that I'm thinking of now? Or you can have the, you know, aggression attack response. And, you know, a lot of that tends to be, you know, culturally shaped and, you know, your social shaping and that kind of thing. And I'm an aggressive person. I'm sure that shocks people who know me. And so my reaction to that has tended to be aggression, and it just depends on what you're comfortable with. And maybe as women, we need to cultivate that more. We need to cultivate the look and the lowering of the voice and that kind of thing more, so that they take us, you guys, whoever you are, take us seriously. And I don't know what other mechanism there is, honestly.
I just want to jump in here really quickly. I wrote a blog post sort of about this at Last Word on Nothing a while back. It was different. It was not a professional situation, but this creep, anyway, he was really creepy. And the thing that happens, though, I mean, he rubbed his junk on my hand, okay? That's what happened. And the thing is, though, when someone does this, and this is so often in these harassment situations, is that it's so, like, inappropriate and so wrong. I'll just give another example. This was years ago. I was rollerblading on this bike path, and this guy jumps out of you know, I got flashed. Just this guy jumps out of the bushes, and you know, it took me like a good 90 seconds for my brain to even process what was happening. And so I think it's very typical that sometimes something like this happens, and you know, an hour later you have the perfect response, but it's difficult to have that. And so we can try and like think about it now, but like I just sort of bristle a little bit at this notion that like, well, if you didn't say something at the time, then like, well, you know, it must be your fault, or you know, that sort of blaming the victim sort of thing. And I think we have to like be careful about that, because you can't, when someone does something that's that inappropriate, like it's not surprising that you don't have a response at the ready, like, because really, most men aren't like that. Like, you're not expecting that. It's not usual behavior. But I'll just say, as there were discussions about this issue, a couple of people emailed me to say that the thing that they have this, you know, most of their interactions that are negative like this tend to be with sources rather than editors, that this is, you know, in terms of harassment. And that's been my experience as well. And I think that that's this is what you're talking about, a source, right? And I think one thing to keep in mind there is that when you're interviewing someone, you're actually in the position of power. Like, you're writing, and if they're a creep, like, you can put that in the story. You can certainly have a conversation with your editor. You know, and it's not, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, oh, this is great material for my story, or, you know, whatever, but realize that, you know, or you can choose not to put them in the story. I mean, whatever, but just recognize that, like, they're not in control there. Like, I guess what I'm saying is, you know, have a sense of empowerment, because you are, as the reporter, you do have some control over that situation. Maybe not, you know, whether they're being creepy. But yeah, but it's not, I mean, they're not, it's a much different situation than when it's someone who has power over you, for instance, an editor or a boss. And I think it's important to make that distinction. That when there's that power differential, that's a different situation that's probably more serious. I don't want to talk about more serious or less serious, but it's different, so.
Thanks, I guess.
You're very welcome.
Mitch.
Mitch Waldrop, Nature. Yeah, I just wanted to say very few words about our board meeting yesterday, and just to assure everybody, if you haven't gotten it already, we're taking all this extremely seriously, particularly, and we talked a lot about those last 3 points and ways to move forward about code of conduct and so forth. One thing I emphasized yesterday, I hope we can include it, we need encouragement and education and all of that for people to talk frankly, directly, and, you know, speak up if something happens. And, you know, be proactive in defending yourself. But speaking is one of these powerful people. I think we need education too. Because what happens is, you know, you come to these meetings and you're just another reporter, you know, young, hungry, just like everybody else, and it's all very social and so forth. And then one day you find yourself an editor in charge of commissioning stories and so forth. And from your perspective, nothing's really changed. You know, you don't feel powerful. You're just trying to make it work. And you don't realize, as I'm now beginning to realize, you don't realize how you appear to this intern candidate or a young freelancer hoping. And, you know, I hope I don't do any sexual harassment. I really try not to. But in a sense, that's the easy one. It's all the other kind of things that were mentioned, all this unthinking slights and so forth. You've got to be aware of that. I'll just give you one example from my experience of just how easy it is to transgress without thinking. So in recent years, I've been doing a lot of charity runs where I have to raise, you know, money, and so I send out a bunch of emails. And it occurred to me, yeah, just this week, oh, last 500 of these emails I sent out, a lot of them went to people who freelance for me. And that could be construed as a shakedown. Okay, and that never even occurred to me. Now, we get all the, you know, sexual harassment training and so forth that any corporation is going to give. We don't get training about this stuff. And I would just hope that sort of thing could happen somehow.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rob Arian from the UC Santa Cruz program. And I wanted to just make a statement about how all of this in the last month, this very wonderful discussion I think that's been going on among the community, motivated by horrible events, has altered what my approach is going to be moving forward with my students. I also wanted to just follow up on one of the slides that Deb showed, and to talk about how the rising tide of women in science journalism, actually for 33 years in the Santa Cruz program, there has never been a single class of graduate students with more men than women. It's always been majority women, except for one class that was exactly half and half. So from the science journalism specialty programs, I think the tide has been rising for decades. So I've been we oversee a very active internship program, both during the school year where our students are working alongside professional editors, and after the program concludes when they have to do a formal summer internship, but they're still under our supervision because they haven't finished their graduate certificate. And I have been aware of incidents during these internships and also at social functions, notably AAAS gatherings where we require our students to go, where these interactions have taken place, these unsavory interactions. And my students have told me about these things. And I now very deeply regret that I was not directly in discussion with the perpetrators to let them know that I, as the advisor of my student, am looking out for her welfare, and I want what you're doing to never occur again. And that is, for me, the profound impact of what has been happening, is that I will no longer have any hesitation, regardless of how long I've been working with that person, regardless of their position within the community, to talk to them directly. Nor will I have any reservation to talk to their superior if this continues in any fashion. So that is how this has affected me. And I hope that this will also be the case for any faculty members who are in a position, because ultimately, I mean, talk about a power imbalance. The intern established editor, that's about as imbalanced as it gets. And for something like this to happen is absolutely inexcusable. I'm so sorry that I didn't do something about this before now, and I will be henceforward.
Thank you, Rob. I'm a Santa Cruz graduate. I just want to say thank you. I mean, this is, I think Rob just explained the solution. This is, we need you men. I mean, this is something, this is a cultural problem. This is like about our community saying, we're not going to put up with this shit. We're not, this is not acceptable. We're not going to let it happen. You can't do this.
I think that's right, and because we want this to have some positive results, Rob, I really appreciate what you said, and I think, speaking as someone who teaches science journalists at the University of Wisconsin, we haven't done enough, and I think we'll be taking that position as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julie Leibach. I'm the web managing editor at Science Friday radio show. I was just wondering, listening to the anecdotes, aside from one individual, none of the offenders, so to speak, were named. And I don't know how important or appropriate that is, because if it's a conversation, I mean, I'm on staff somewhere, but sometimes I freelance. I kind of want to know where these places are, who these people are. I know some are sources, that's a little harder. If they're established institutions, it seems like maybe we should know. But maybe that's unimportant, maybe it's a libel issue, just wondering.
I think that, and that's a discussion we had with the recent incidents at Scientific American in which names were slowly named, right? I think we all struggle with that. One of the things we actually talked about in this panel was setting up a survey where we could ask women to come in, tell their stories, report what had happened with them, see if we could actually identify patterns. I think patterns at institutions might be as important to us as individual actions. And I think the other thing we have talked about is ways that we can build perhaps into contracts measures that stand up for freelancers in particular who are outside of the protection of the institution. And I think you actually had a contract that included
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, literally last week got a contract for a publication I hadn't written before that had 2.5 pages that were about sexual harassment. And they were actually, it wasn't about you as a freelancer, here's how we're protecting you, but it was like you as a freelancer, like you're representing us, and here are things that are inappropriate, and if you do these things, here's what's going to happen, and here's how we're going to how we're going to deal with it and what will happen and how we'll, hang you and all of that. But I thought it was really interesting that this, this publication was saying, you're representing us and this is not acceptable, and it'd be great to see that in more contracts. But it just, I think it reflected sort of an institution that said, this kind of thing is not acceptable and our reputation's important, and this is something that's contrary to the reputation that we want.
Would you like to see it more public?
I kind of would, just because I know it's a fine line between, what you might interpret as sexual harassment or inappropriate might not be to the other person. And if they realize after one offense or something, I don't know, maybe it's a 3-strike rule or something like that. Like you said, a pattern. I'm not going to go around with a little checkboard or something, but.
And I'd like to see us do that. I'd like to see us have a place where if people had a troubling interaction, they had a place to at least file it in there so we could find these patterns. It might be something that we could ask different associations to then actually talk to the publisher or whatever and say, we're getting these reports from our members.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
if it were like a private committee or something that was entrusted with this information.
and that might be something, I know NASW is setting up a committee, that might be, right, Mitch? There might be something there.
Yeah, we're looking at, we talked about this quite a lot yesterday, but it turns out there are all sorts of legal ramifications you need to understand very clearly. Doing something privately as an individual is very different from doing it in the name of the NASW.
Right.
And also our status as a 501c6, actually precludes us from doing certain things. So we have to understand that very clearly.
So we also have to figure out the best way. But I'm glad you raised the issue because that is one, when things go public, you actually get action. And you have consequences. And I think we all want to see consequences, so we need to be smarter about figuring out how to do that. Thank you. We'll put this on our manifesto list.
Deb, I'm sorry, may I add Kathleen?
Yeah, please, Kathleen. Sorry.
So what I saw in the weekend after my post about Bora is there was a bit of a witch hunt, and it kind of scared me. So I think it is women need to help other women to talk with the person you perceived that was harassing you, because women can misconstrue things, and it is the last thing that you want to do to say those 2 magical words and ruin someone's career if it was not in fact what that was. So we need to find ways. If you the victim can sometimes not do that herself, but there needs to be a way to verify that before naming names.
That's an excellent point too, Kathleen. Thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name is Luba Staszewski. I'm from Nautilus, and I guess the first thing to say, thanks very much for organizing the panel. It's definitely a continuing issue of our time, and I guess a testament of its importance is the amount of people who are here. I'm also grateful to, to see something like a basic manifesto up in print, which I think as a young publication isn't anything that we've thought about implementing or even putting into our contract, which is all just about, you must deliver this story on such and such a date. So it's really good to be educated about this. I do want to say, just, kind of in reference of, who we use as writers and our pool of writers, I think for a young publication for ourselves, it's sort of more a matter of kind of access and, who are sending us pitches. Kind of until we get, a huge pool, we're just kind of going to the people who are coming to us. So, that kind of creates its own, I guess, narrowness that we have to work with, with regard to gender. I do want to say something, and in terms of, and I'm not sure kind of how to generalize this or what conclusions to draw of this, but I almost feel like my experience has kind of been that there's a difference between, in terms of gender, is having an ability to prove yourself and being able to write for a publication, and then within the administrative responsibilities of a company, of being heard and being taken seriously, or having your ideas heard. So, I don't know, sometimes it feels to me like almost two different things. Like, everyone is happy to have good work, with regardless to gender, but then it almost seems like, on a decision-making level within the administration, there are a few voices that are heard.
Right, and that was one of the slides we put up that kind of looked at that, like decisions being made at the top of publications, shows that I think that we're still working to change the conversation at the top. Does anyone here want to address that?
Since I was the one who mentioned Nautilus, so thank you very much for coming forward, and I really appreciate the tone of your response, so thanks for that as well. And I do want to say, I maybe didn't say this explicitly enough, that because all of us work with and within publications, I think we all understand that this is complicated. That there is no, this would be easy to fix if there were individual bad actors that we could identify on each masthead, in each C-suite, in each, at the top of each blog network. That wouldn't be hard. It is hard because our profession is so complex and because there are so many moving parts. I think that for the most part, everyone who works at any one of the magazines I could name, including my own, which have the magazines which have an uneven gender balance visible, have individually good reasons for that happening. I don't think, for the most part, that people are acting in bad faith. Nevertheless, the pattern is there. And untangling how in these very complex systems we continue to create that pattern, I think, is the task that we have in front of us. So thank you very much.
I think one thing, too, that we sort of all talked about privately is just this thing where you're like, you've got this idea and you're pitching and like, hey, let's, I think I told a story like this and like, it's not getting any traction, and then man walks in the room, presents the very same thing, and bam, best idea they ever heard of. Like, that's just really frustrating. And, the thing is, it happens a lot, and maybe it happens to men too, but I don't know.
I would just say, too, sort of a related point that hasn't really come up is the issue of pay equity. I was on a panel today where a woman freelancer said that she sometimes works for free, and the man on the panel said, oh, I never work for free. And I think as long as there are people willing to work for free, those people are not going to be treated with as much respect. I think it's something that we all need to get more assertive about, is sort of insisting on pay that we deserve.
Agreed. And we've got about 20 minutes, and then they're going to boot us out of the room, so I'm going to try to move this forward. I would like to give as many of you as possible have a chance to talk.
Hi, I'm Megan Voss, and I'm from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We're not the only publishing community that's been having these issues. I'm tuned into the science fiction community pretty hard because I do some writing for some science fiction blogs. And one thing I want to say is thank you for having a much more mature discussion than has been occurring in the science fiction community. On that note, some publications have been experimenting. Most publications have your standard anti-discrimination statement, but then some are trying something where they're actively seeking out more submissions from women and minorities. They put statements up saying, we want you to submit, we really want you to submit. And that has made a difference in some of these publication submissions. Some of them have published changed numbers. And they're like, we're seeing more coming from women and ethnic minorities. And I thought that was a very interesting experiment. None of the big publishers have made any comments on whether they're getting any results on that yet, but I thought that was an interesting approach to say, to just say it explicitly. One statement on the website has made a difference.
That's a really good point. Thank you. Over here.
Hi, Tom Ulrich, Boston Children's Hospital and New England Science Writers. Thank you all for coming up and holding this discussion with everybody. I'm sure we're all thinking the same thing, that we hope that as we all go home from this weekend that we continue these discussions back, at our offices and houses and whatnot. In that spirit, at New England Science Writers, we're talking about having some sort of an event for the local science journalism and also for the science writing students, where we have so many of them around. We're just sort of in the initial discussions. And given that we're getting short on time, I'll cut this shorter than what I had intended when I stood up, which was we're having a lot of back and forth about what sort of things to bring up, because we don't want to just have it be an overall conversation, as valuable as that is. We also want to talk about what we can do about it and how we arm people with tools to protect themselves against harassment. What to do if you are harassed. What is the sort of resources that you can reach out to protect yourself, and also to just address occasions as they happen. So what I had hoped to do was stand up and tap the wisdom of this crowd around me for suggestions about the sorts of things that we should be bringing into that discussion, but I don't want to, take over the mic or the rest of the time. So I would hope I'll be around. I would love to hear anyone's suggestions. I'm in the ScienceWriters2013 app that was put out, so I would love to hear from anybody who has any ideas about what we can do on a small scale in Boston as we have these conversations, and then hopefully we can also spread those suggestions out more broadly to the community as a whole.
That's a great idea, and it might be something we could ask NASW to do too, to set up some kind of program. Okay, so NASW is already planning to put up some resources on the website?
Yes.
And is looking for volunteers. Okay, thank you. Rose.
Hi, I'm Rose. I'm a freelancer, and I have a million thoughts about this, but I will say two things. One, I'm also the managing editor for a group of journalists called Lady Bits, and we publish, we have a collection on Medium, which is all about harassment, and so if you have stories and you want to publish them, we can publish them anonymously. You can publish them if you have a Medium account, which is open to everyone. So I encourage people to go there, and if you want to talk about moving forward, steps moving forward as well. We have a couple of posts. We have a post from Maren and a post from Kathleen, and so it's a space if you're interested. We're also, as a group of female journalists, looking for people to write for us, and we pay. So if you want to up the numbers in terms of places that are taking female writers, we have. Or we work with Popular Science and lots of other places. So talk to me about that later if you want. The other thing that I would like to say in terms of moving forward and things that each and every one of us can do, I really liked the slide you put up about how what we can do is our personal, we can't change the world, but we can change what we do. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned and that has come out of this for me is just holding everybody in your life accountable and not assuming that the men in your life simply aren't capable of being decent human beings. And the boys will be boys thing that Deborah talked about. I mean, even little things that you think oh, it's okay, he's just a dude. That's not okay. You can hold the people in your life accountable for what they're doing and starting small, because as we've seen, if you don't stop it at the beginning, it just continues and escalates.
That's absolutely right. Thank you, Rose. And I'm sure there'll be people lining up to talk to you about Lady Bits. Over here.
Hi, I'm Mary Beckman. I'm the elevator lady. So the awards thing is really abysmal, and I'm wondering if there's anything you can do to either encourage other awards hander-outers. Is it possible to do judge awards anonymously with judge them blindly, or is it too obvious? Is that already being done? I'm just wondering if there's anything we can do about the awards.
I'm unhappy and baffled by the award situation. It was actually, I did not see the NASW slide until my student did the analysis, and I had a big exhale over that one. I'm hoping part of the thing is that more women will be part of the judging situation. I don't know where we are in terms of making those decisions. And again, numbers aren't everything, but I think making this obvious, having more of us assume positions where we are able to make a difference, and then making a difference, right? Again, talking about it and not being quiet about it. So for instance, I am the guest editor for Best American Science and Nature Writing next year, and I expect to see a reasonable number of women in that publication.
I just want to say something really quick, and that is, I don't know that making like I don't want to see necessarily a female science writing award, like that doesn't solve the problem. And I actually think that probably what we're seeing in the awards, I mean, maybe partially it's that, you know, they're saying, oh, this thing written by the man is so great, but I think that it probably reflects what's being published. If you go back to some of these magazines, and there are a lot of science magazines out there where you go and the feature well month after month is all men. Yeah, and that said, I think as women, you know, maybe it's time for us to really like pick some of these publications and say, all right, it's, you know, this publication month, let's all pitch them. You know, it's not, yeah, let's pitch bomb some of these places. You know, because if we could show, I think that one thing that does happen, I know that I am guilty of this. There are places where I'm just sort of like, at this point, like, I'm sick of you. I'm not going to keep pitching you because I'm tired of you ignoring my pitches and then, you know, taking that idea from some dude. And that's not to say that they're stealing my idea. It's just that, you know, it's not a good idea until it's, you know, pitched by someone who's already there. But so I do think that, you know, as women, let's pitch bomb them too. That's.
I am intrigued by the idea.
There's one other thing, and then I want to move over here real quickly, and that is with books. I have asked myself, because I've judged a lot of book awards, if publishers are actually entering enough books by women. We get these stacks of books, and I'll go, well, where's so-and-so's book? Where's so-and-so's book? It's as if the publishers themselves are not making that decision. And that's something, again, that I certainly am going to be mentioning to my editor, but that I think we need to also start working on internally, or at least making a little bit of noise about it. Anyone else real quickly, because I want to...
Oh, I just wanted to say, Mary, that you mentioned gender-blinded submissions? Well, name-blinded. Name-blinded. So that actually, that happens in the music conservatory world. That when people are competing for like piano competitions, they perform behind screens. And I think in some competitions, they're even instructed to wear particular footwear so the judges can't hear high heels coming up to the piano, to as much as possible reduce unconscious gender bias. Yeah.
Yes, over here.
My name is Kelly Terrell, and I'm a freelancer. I wanted to thank not only the panel, but everybody in this room participating in the discussion. I think that we need to stand up for one another, both men standing up for women and women standing up for one another. When I was 23, first job out of college, I was in a high-powered lab. My boss had a big name in a significant research university, and I entered the lab with the warning by the other females in the lab and in the office, oh, well, so-and-so he's a harasser. But it wasn't put in that way. Oh, he does this, he does that, just ignore it. And I allowed myself to take on that mentality. And I allowed myself to be harassed over and over again. I was never threatened. I was never put into a very bad situation. But I'm really encouraged that all of us here today are having this conversation. I think we all do need to stand up for one another. And when we see something happening that's wrong, we need to say something. We need to speak up. Because it's often hard for the victim to know how to do that.
Thank you. That was great. Over here.
Oh, I just took it off the thing. My name's Carrie Fry, and I'm a communications coordinator. And all the publications that my center does has to go through me. So I'm always the first one to touch the publication. And, you know, it's interesting that nobody's brought up the fact that women can do this to us. I mean, my first boss, who I now have her job, was awful and crazy and completely unprofessional. Within the first 4 months of my job, you know, she threatened to fire me because of who I was dating. Yeah, and you know, I think it's important that women understand that we do this to ourselves and we do this to each other, which then allows men to see it and be like, that woman just did it to that woman, so maybe I can get away with it. And I have a very hard time with women confronting me or being mean to me, but my science job is mostly men, and the last time a guy yelled at me at my job, I looked at him and I said, if you ever speak to me that way again, none of your publications will get done. So I think, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about men harassing women, but I also think that there needs to be a huge evaluation on women harassing women, and I'm hoping that maybe I can talk to other folks later on today about that. So thank you for the men. I just wanted to be like, women are too sometimes.
So so true. Emily?
I think that what you say is entirely, I'm not going to endorse completely that men are just like copycats of the way women treat each other, but I do think that, yes, women do that, and that we, as women, if you're women in power, I'm not necessarily one of those, that you need to be mindful, because I've had this experience from women who are in power, that you may be acting in a competitive way with someone who is also a woman, and you need to really be mindful of how you are treating that person, whether or not you are acting in the form of a mentor or in the form of a competitor trying to keep somebody down.
Agreed.
Hi, my name's Papin. I'm a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. I don't want to end on this note, so I'm glad there's other people. I come from a family of really great men. My dad's great, his dad was great, my husband is fantastic, and I know that I'm really fortunate for that. I really do. When I was younger, I didn't know that that was me being fortunate for that. I didn't realize that was something to be fortunate for, but it is, and I know that. But I guess it's important because it shaped my worldview, and I have one question that I hope you can answer. I have been in a situation, not a harassment situation, but where I had an advisor from my first year in undergrad who had an undergraduate thesis advisor. And I noticed he was always really, really, really mean to me and really, really, really nice to my male counterpart. And we were the same age, same subject matter that we studied. We did the same amount of work. We typically had the same work ethic. And the thing is that sorry.
So it's not that. We're just quickly. We got 2 minutes. So maybe what we should do, are you asking how to handle that?
Well, I haven't gotten to that. Real quickly?
Really quickly.
Okay, so the thing that I was wondering is I'm not a cynical person. And when I realized that, I didn't assume that was because of gender. I still don't know if that was.
So your point?
I'm one of those, sorry. I don't remember what I was saying. Every time I get interrupted, I just like forget where I'm at. The thing that I was trying to say was I don't know where that line is. Like I can't just assume that every man, the reason that someone yells at someone is because of gender. So how do you know where that line is?
That is a good point. Hold that thought, because I'm going to see if we have time to actually address it in a meaningful way. Over here, quickly.
Okay, my name is Tazgola. I was a journalist for 20 years before taking a buyout. I'm now a press officer for PETA, promoting the work of scientists there. That's my background. I grew up with sisters who supported me unconditionally. I went out into the world thinking that's how women treated each other, and had a rude awakening, and was even more disappointed when other women said the worst bosses they ever had were women. So on the tails of what this lady said back here, I hope that's not still going on. I wanted to talk about that, and it's near and dear to my heart, these women's issues. So I hope if it's going on that we just support each other.
I do too.
Thank you.
I would really like to answer her question. So Judy, quickly.
Yes, I'll be very quick. I'm an older science writer, as you can see, but in my experience, and I've had a lot of it, a lot of this comes from a sense of entitlement that the abuser does not recognize. I'll just be very brief, but when I was a very young science writer, I went off to cover a genetics meeting for a newspaper that no longer exists, and because the science was very good, the stories appeared on the front page, but it wasn't my byline. It was the guy who was back in New York. This was up in Maine. And what was so really interesting about this, when that newspaper folded and that person was looking for a job, he came to my newspaper with my stories and presented to my editor. And you know, I think he was just totally oblivious of this. And this was, I think a lot of people don't realize that culturally this is an old pattern, and you have to be aware of that. It's basically about power, not always about gender, but I'm not sure he would have done it if I'd been male. So.
Agreed. Power is at the heart of a lot of this. Does anyone have a clear sense of what the line is where you recognize that it's a gender issue? I think we all actually struggle with.
I think this is what makes it really tough too, and it's not the individual stuff, it's just the patterns. It's like once is one thing, but when it happens, 6 times, 10 times at the same publication or with the same person. And this is part of the way that some of the creeps get away with it too, right? Is that it's like if you just kind of get to that line and it's this thing of like blaming you, like, oh, you're really like, and I know that this happened to Kathleen at first. It's sort of like this sense of, you're making too much out of it, don't be so sensitive. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to be really careful about that. But for me, I think that it really is about patterns and something that keeps happening. And again, I think a lot of this is institutional, where it's not just I don't think that men like get together every morning and say, how are we going to oppress women today? and it may not even be conscious in a lot of places.
But I agree with that. Repeated behavior sends you a message, right? Okay, last point.
I'm Diana Kenny. I'm the science writer and editor at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, and I want to agree with everyone who has just said that it's just a matter of speaking up. I've been working in scientific environments since the early 80s when harassment was pervasive and often very subtle, and I've figured out my own way of dealing with it, and I just refuse to stop taking myself seriously, and I refuse when a conversation, it starts very early, and usually it's a coded message, it's not some blatant harassing thing. But you have to learn to recognize those signs where someone is just feeling you out to see if you're weak in that way, and you just stare them down, as you say, and you keep going, you keep it on an intellectual level, because that's where science is, and the first one who spoke, you persevere.
So we're going to put the stare on our list. Thank you all so much.